if you were to rewind the clock back to 2005 when the 8-year-old me had just played what would continue to be his favourite video game of all time, you would have a very hard time convincing that boy that in 20 years he would be making a YouTube video with a title like this. And yet, here we are. Star Wars Fate of the Old Republic, or KOTOR, has just been revealed, and I feel like just based on the little bit of information we have, you could immediately feel the internet split into two instincts. One side heard Old Republic and jumped straight to this is KOTOR 3. The other side heard spiritual successor and thought, so it's not the thing we've been waiting 20 years for? Then what the fuck is it? My view is basically this: it's not KOTOR 3, and that's not bad news. In fact, I think it's the best news we could have possibly have gotten for a brand new game set in this era. Because the moment you try to force it into being a direct continuation of what already exists, you start shrinking it. And even worse, you deprive us of the one thing many of us loved about KOTOR in the first place: meaningful choices. So let's start with what we actually know, beginning with just the title itself. You don't call something Fate of the Old Republic if it's set in the middle of a period. That language signals an era-defining hinge point, something that resolves or births the next age. But okay, look, we don't need to rely solely on just vibes-based analysis because the official wording is already pretty clear. The public-facing pitch describes the game as a narrative-driven single-player action RPG where you step into the role of a Force user, and you're on a journey through a galaxy on the edge of rebirth. And the key line that should completely remove the possibility of any sort of sequel theories is this: StarWars.com explicitly frames it as not a direct sequel or continuation. Now to me, this isn't some sort of marketing doublespeak or whatever, it seems like it's a pretty clear boundary. The description stresses that every decision deepens your journey towards light or darkness. The vice president of Lucasfilm Games, Douglas Riley, also frames their intent as honouring the legacy of the original games by creating something in the same tradition of a deep, cinematic, choice-driven role-playing game. So the design philosophy that they're selling us is not we're continuing a beloved plotline, it's we're reviving a kind of experience. And that's where I think people need to be honest about what they're actually asking for when they say they want KOTOR 3. Because a direct sequel sounds exciting until you ask a simple question: how much freedom can it really have? If your story is pinned to established endpoints, whether that's other games or tie-in lore or an MMO that has already covered huge ground, then your role-playing starts to become decorative. Yeah, sure, you can choose dialogue options and you can tweak morality points and maybe even nudge outcomes locally, but the macro outcome is already decided. At that point, you don't really feel like you're shaping history. You're just going to be acting inside of a history that has already been written. And personally, I think that matters a lot more in Star Wars than almost any other franchise, because it's my personal view that modern Star Wars has somewhat become a victim of setting their stories far too close to the canon. I mean, let's just take The Acolyte for example. The official material places it around 100 years before the prequel era, but in The Phantom Menace, Ki Adimundi says,
"Impossible. The Sith have been extinct for a millennium."
Now, I'm not here to litigate that whole debate. My point is simpler. When you set stories close to fixed statements like that one, you create a ceiling. Now, sure, I definitely know for a fact that you can still do interesting work, but your story has to constantly negotiate what it's allowed to imply, what must remain hidden, and what can never meaningfully change. The closer you are to the rails, the more your plot has to bend around the track instead of running free. You can even see a similar limitation in the post-original trilogy space too. The Mandalorian is famously positioned after the fall of the Empire and in the gap before the First Order era truly arrives. It's roughly 5 years after Return of the Jedi. But even when that show is firing on all cylinders, it still exists under an inevitability. Certain pieces of the galaxy can't be moved too far because we already know what the era eventually looks like. That's the core reason the Old Republic era hit like it did for many of us in the first place. It was the sense that you weren't playing in the margins of someone else's story. You were inside a world where your choices could matter because the timeline wasn't already boxed in by a dozen on-screen endpoints. KOTOR 1 and 2 are set 5 years apart, but Star Wars The Old Republic is set roughly 300 years later. And for many of us, back during the time that this was first announced, we were positively livid. The issue that I and many others had was that rather than give us the end to the trilogy we wanted, due to numerous issues that I won't get into now, in 2011 we ended up with the Revan novel by Drew Karpyshyn. That book is explicitly positioned as a bridge. It fills in gaps around the KOTOR era and also helps set up the era the MMO is playing in. Now I'm going to keep this spoiler free because there's a lot of people who still haven't read that book and it ties to the Old Republic, which is definitely worth playing. But what I will say is this, among KOTOR fans, that novel has been undoubtedly controversial. You see, the issue is once you start bridging, you inevitably start choosing. You start locking in interpretations and declaring certain outcomes more canon than others. And if you're coming from Knights of the Old Republic, a game that lives on player choice, that's always going to be sensitive territory. And even beyond the novel, to this day there are people who remain critical of the MMO's relationship to the KOTOR legacy. Some love it, whilst others can't stand it. In fact, I even held a grudge against the Old Republic for so long that even though I signed up to play it when it first released, I never actually once logged in to play it until just under 2 years ago. Which is a shame because it's honestly very good and has been satisfying my itch for Star Wars role-playing pretty damn well. Now some fans like me enjoyed the Old Republic as its own thing, but we dislike what it implies retroactively about the earlier games. The point is, that entire bridge period is already emotionally charged ground. If they stick closely to the existing bridge material, you're walking straight into the most controversial patch of that timeline and asking a new generation of players to just accept it. Which is a bold move considering how many of us have been arguing about it since 2011. But if they don't stick closely to it, if for example they decide to retcon, rewrite or reframe that bridge in a way that meaningfully changes what came after, then you're not just tweaking a book. You're stepping on the toes of an MMO that has been running for over a decade, with expansions, arcs, factions, romances, choices and characters people have lived with for years. That's not just lore anymore, that's actual time invested. And besides, from an industry perspective, I just don't believe Lucasfilm Games are going to decide out of nowhere to invalidate a decade-long live service MMO that still has an active community. Especially when Riley literally says he spent 2 decades working on Star Wars games, including Star Wars The Old Republic, and he emphasizes how much these stories mean to the fans. That's not the language of someone gearing up to wipe the slate clean underneath an ongoing game. And that's also why, when you factor in the people involved, anyone who believes they'll actually just retcon everything should seriously reconsider that. Casey Hudson is leading this project, the director of the original Knights of the Old Republic and the Mass Effect trilogy, and Jade Empire, a game that I personally consider one of the most underrated RPGs of all time. Hudson's whole career brand has always been player agency and long-form storytelling. In the StarWars.com interview, he's even talking about delivering that combination of player agency and immersion that was at the heart of Knights of the Old Republic. So if you put all of that together, the MMO still running, the existing bridge material being divisive, Lucasfilm Games explicitly drawing a line around not a direct sequel, and Hudson's own history, the most plausible explanation is the simplest one. They're doing this the way they have to do it if they want it to work. That means creating a new story in the same tradition without stepping on existing continuity that already has millions of hours and emotional investment baked into it. And this is why I'm glad it's not a direct sequel, because it means we're stepping onto an empty canvas with all kinds of possibilities open. Now of course, ultimately as of right now, it isn't confirmed where exactly it falls in the timeline, but as far as I'm concerned, the premise they're selling only makes sense if they have enough room to make the choices feel consequential at the scale they're promising. And that room doesn't come from forcing the game to be the next chapter in an already crowded sequence. It comes from doing what KOTOR did originally, stepping far enough away from the gravitational pull of everything else that you can build something with its own weight. So if you care about the Old Republic era, I honestly think you should be rooting for this to be bold enough to stand on its own. Not because nostalgia is wrong, but because nostalgia becomes suffocating when it demands the same story again. The legacy doesn't need to be directly continued to be respected. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do with a beloved era is give it a new horizon and let it become history. The kind of history that a new story can be built on, rather than be trapped inside. If they can pull that off, then Fate of the Old Republic won't need to be KOTOR free. It'll be something much rarer. A return to the kind of Star Wars storytelling that actually has room to surprise you.